It began, as these things so often do, with a machine that had no idea what it was about to touch. Late in 1992, a construction crew was widening a section of highway in San Diego County, California. It was routine work, the kind of project that happens quietly all over the country without anyone giving it a second thought. Because the excavation crossed land known to hold fossils, a paleontologist from the local Natural History Museum was on hand, standing by as the law required, watching bulldozers peel back layer after layer of ancient soil. Nobody expected the day to be memorable. Then the blade struck something that wasn't rock and wasn't ordinary dirt. It struck bone. The crew stopped. Museum staff moved in, and as they cleared away the sediment by hand, a picture began to emerge that was far stranger than a simple fossil find. They were looking at the remains of a mastodon, an elephant-like giant that had roamed the region during the last ice age. That alone would have been an interesting but unremarkable discovery. Fossil bones turn up during construction projects more often than most people realize. But something about this one was different, and the paleontologists on site could feel it. Over the next 5 months, the San Diego Natural History Museum carried out a careful, painstaking excavation of the site, and what came out of the ground would eventually detonate one of the most contentious disputes in modern archaeology. To understand why a single mastodon skeleton could cause such an uproar, you first need to understand the story it was about to challenge. For most of the 20th century, the settlement of the Americas was taught as one of the cleanest narratives in all of prehistory. During the depths of the last ice age, so much of the planet's water was locked into glaciers that global sea levels dropped dramatically. This exposed a wide land bridge across what is now the Bering Strait, connecting Siberia to Alaska. Sometime around 13,000 years ago, according to the traditional account, small bands of hunters crossed that bridge, followed the retreating ice south, and spread across 2 entire continents. These people left behind a distinctive style of stone spear point, fluted and carefully shaped, first identified near the town of Clovis, New Mexico. The name stuck, not just to the artifact style but to the people who supposedly made it, and to the entire theory of how the Americas were first populated. It was a tidy story, easy to diagram, easy to teach, easy to defend. And for decades, it hardened from a hypothesis into something closer to doctrine. Careers were built on it. Museum exhibits were designed around it. Textbooks repeated it without much room for doubt. Anyone who suggested that humans might have arrived earlier than the Clovis migration wasn't just proposing an alternative data point. They were, in the eyes of much of the field, questioning the foundation on which an entire discipline had been built. Archaeologists even had a name for the reflexive defense of the old timeline. Some called it Clovis first dogma, and there was a well-known joke in the field that claiming to have found pre-Clovis evidence of humans in the Americas was about as credible as claiming to have spotted Elvis working behind a fast food counter. This was the wall of skepticism waiting for whatever had been buried in that San Diego hillside. As museum researchers carefully excavated the site, later named the Cheruti Mastodon site after the paleontologist who first noticed the bone, the picture that emerged looked less like a fossil and more like the leftovers of a meal. Several of the mastodon's heavy limb bones had been broken in a particular way. Fresh, still living bone doesn't snap cleanly like a dry stick. It fractures in a spiral pattern, the way a green branch splinters. That's exactly what the researchers found. Even stranger, 2 large rounded ball joints from the animal's thigh bones had been set down deliberately near each other, one facing up and one facing down, as though placed rather than simply scattered by natural forces. And scattered through the fine, undisturbed sediment around the bones were several large, heavy stones. Stones that had no obvious geological reason to be there. Stones that bore the telltale marks of having been used as hammers and anvils. Put together, the evidence painted an unmistakable picture to the researchers who found it. Someone had positioned a mastodon bone against a stone anvil and struck it repeatedly with a stone hammer, likely to break it open for the marrow inside, or to shape sharp fragments for other uses. It looked, in other words, like the remains of a very old kitchen. That alone would have been a significant discovery. Mastodon butchery sites are valuable windows into ancient life wherever they're found. The only remaining question was one word: when? Because the bone itself no longer held enough collagen for standard radiocarbon dating, researchers turned to a different clock buried inside it, one based on the steady, predictable decay of uranium into thorium. The bones were sent to a U.S. Geological Survey laboratory, where a geologist ran the analysis using state-of-the-art techniques. The result, when it came back, was almost unbelievable. The bones were roughly 130,000 years old, give or take a margin of error of about 9,000 years. To put that number into perspective, the traditional Clovis first timeline placed the earliest Americans at around 13,000 years ago. This new figure was roughly 10 times older than that. It didn't just predate the accepted timeline for the peopling of the Americas. It predated the widely accepted timeline for when modern humans, Homo sapiens, are thought to have left Africa at all, an event most researchers place somewhere between 50 and 70,000 years ago. If the dating was accurate, whoever broke those bones in that California streambed couldn't have been us. It might have been Neanderthals. It might have been Denisovans. It might have been some population of ancient humans that science hasn't even identified yet, a branch of the human family that reached North America, left behind a single broken skeleton, and then vanished from history without a trace. When the research team finally published their findings in the prestigious journal Nature in the spring of 2017, they were deliberately cautious in how they framed the claim. They didn't assert they knew exactly which species had done the butchering. They described the presence of an unidentified member of the genus Homo, and let the radiometric date make its own case. Even so, the paper landed like a bombshell across the scientific press, and the backlash was immediate and fierce. Critics didn't simply raise questions. Many went straight for the foundation of the claim. The core objection echoed a phrase familiar to anyone who has followed debates over extraordinary scientific claims. Exceptional assertions demand exceptional evidence, and a single damaged mastodon skeleton, however striking, was not enough on its own to rewrite the entire chronology of human migration to two continents. Where, skeptics asked, were the human remains? Where were the unmistakable stone tools, the finely worked blades that define nearly every other confirmed early human site? Why was there no second site, no third, nothing else in the Americas anywhere close to this age to corroborate it? There was also a more specific and, frankly, quite reasonable alternative explanation on the table. The bones, after all, had been unearthed during a highway construction project, dug up by the heavy machinery of a modern freeway expansion. Some researchers suggested that the very act of digging up the site, the grinding, crushing force of excavation equipment, might have produced fractures in the old bone that only looked like the deliberate work of ancient hands. Others pointed to the more mundane possibility of geological pressure. Over a span of 130 millennia, the sheer weight of accumulating sediment above the bones could conceivably crack them in patterns that mimic intentional human breakage, without any person ever having been involved. To their credit, the researchers behind the original study never claimed their find was beyond question. Thomas Demir, the paleontologist who led the excavation and the subsequent paper, was notably measured in public statements about the discovery, acknowledging that a single site could not overturn a century of accumulated evidence on its own. What he asked for instead was simply that the scientific community keep an open mind rather than dismiss the possibility outright, and that other researchers consider looking for similar evidence in places previously ignored because they were assumed to be too old to matter. More than half a decade later, the Cheruti Mastodon site remains unresolved. It sits at the far edge of the debate over the peopling of the Americas, a real peer-reviewed finding that the majority of the field still isn't ready to accept, not out of stubbornness, but because the alternative explanations involving construction damage and natural fracturing have never been fully ruled out. It remains the loudest and most extreme data point in a much larger and steadily accumulating pile of evidence. Because it turns out the Cheruti Mastodon wasn't an isolated anomaly. It was simply the most dramatic entry in a growing list of sites where the ground gave up dates that didn't fit the accepted script, evidence that, time and again, was met first with dismissal, and only decades later with a second look. To find the next chapter of this story, you have to travel far north, almost to the edge of the map, into the Yukon Territory of Canada, to a set of 3 small limestone caves overlooking a river valley. The site is called Bluefish Caves, and reaching it today still requires either a long, difficult overland journey or a helicopter, through terrain that offers no comfort in any season. In the deep past, though, this remote corner of the world sat near the heart of everything. During the Ice Age, when sea levels were low, this region was part of Beringia, the vast unglaciated grassland that stretched between Siberia and Alaska. If early humans walked into North America on foot, this is more or less where that walk would have passed through. An archaeologist named Jacques Cinquemars began excavating Bluefish Caves in the late 1970s and continued his work there for roughly a decade. Digging through frozen sediment, he and his team recovered thousands of bone fragments from Ice Age animals. Horses, mammoths, caribou, bison. On many of these bones, Cinquemars noticed something that caught his attention: thin, straight marks that looked less like the ragged damage left by a predator's teeth and more like the clean scoring a stone blade leaves when separating meat from bone. Some bones also appeared to have been deliberately smashed to access the marrow inside. When samples were sent off for dating, the results suggested an age of around 30,000 years, more than double what the Clovis first model allowed for any human presence in North America. Cinquemars was not a fringe figure making wild claims from the sidelines. He was a credentialed, professionally trained archaeologist working for a respected national institution, and he presented his findings to his peers in good faith, expecting serious scientific engagement. Instead, his work was largely brushed aside. This was the height of the era when the Clovis first model was treated less as a scientific hypothesis and more as settled fact, and any challenge to it was received with open skepticism bordering on ridicule. Colleagues suggested the marks on Cinquemars's bones could easily have been left by scavenging carnivores gnawing at the carcasses, or by the natural abrasion of bones tumbling against gravel in a riverbed. The dates themselves weren't necessarily disputed. Ancient bones of that age were unremarkable in a place like Beringia. What was disputed was the presence of people to leave marks on them at all. Cinquemars never recanted his findings, but his career and his site slid into a kind of academic limbo. The bones he had excavated were boxed up and placed into storage, where they sat largely untouched for nearly 3 decades while the field moved on without him. Then, years later, a younger researcher named Lauriane Bourgeon decided to take another look. She pulled the old boxes of bones back out of storage and re-examined them using modern microscopic techniques, methods far more precise than what had been available in Cinquemars's day, capable of distinguishing the fine difference between a cut made by a stone tool, a scrape left by an animal's teeth, and random damage from natural abrasion. On the jawbone of an ancient horse, she found what she was looking for: clean, straight, parallel incisions positioned exactly where a person would cut to remove the tongue of an animal being butchered. It was not the kind of mark an animal's teeth or a tumbling rock could produce. It was a signature of deliberate human work. The radiocarbon dating her team subsequently published placed the site at roughly 24,000 years old, instantly making Bluefish Caves the oldest confirmed evidence of human presence in North America, thousands of years earlier than the Clovis migration. It didn't fully vindicate every one of Cinquemars's original claims. His oldest proposed dates remain debated. But it confirmed the essential point he had spent his career defending. People had been in the far north of the continent, butchering horses, long before conventional theory said they could exist there at all. Jacques Cinquemars died in 2021, having lived just long enough to see the scientific tide begin turning back in his favor, decades after his work was quietly dismissed. The vindication of Bluefish Caves also lent support to a broader theory that had been gaining traction among researchers: the idea of a Beringian standstill, in which a population of early migrants became isolated on the Beringian land bridge for an extended period, unable to move further south because of massive ice sheets blocking the way, until the ice eventually retreated and allowed them to spread into the rest of the continent. If that theory is correct, a butchered horse bone at the northern threshold of that ice barrier is exactly the kind of trace such a stranded population might leave behind. But the Arctic wasn't the only place where old assumptions were being tested. Far to the south, high in the mountains of northern Mexico, another controversial discovery was unfolding, one that would rest entirely on stone rather than bone. Nearly 3 kilometers above sea level, in the Estero Mountains, sits a cave called Chiquihuite, reachable only after a punishing climb through thin mountain air. A team led by archaeologist Cyprian Ardelean spent years excavating the cave's floor, working in difficult conditions to sift through sediment that had gone undisturbed for an extraordinarily long time. What they recovered was nearly 2,000 pieces of broken limestone that the team identified as stone tools. Flakes, points, and cutting implements, the discarded byproducts of someone shaping rock in the dark interior of the cave. The layers containing these stones were dated to between roughly 31 and 33,000 years old, with evidence of more sustained human activity clustering closer to 12 to 26,000 years ago. Like Bluefish Caves and the Cheruti site, this placed potential human activity in the Americas far earlier than the traditional timeline allowed, and notably deep in the interior of the continent, not just at its northern doorstep. But Chikwih White had a significant problem that the other sites didn't share. There were no human bones, no preserved genetic material, no hearths, no ash, no charred wood, none of the more obvious traces of daily human life. The entire case rested on whether those roughly 2,000 stones had been intentionally shaped by human hands or produced by natural forces alone, such as rockfall or the slow grinding pressure of collapsing cave sediment. This is where a particular term becomes important in archaeology: a geofact. A geofact is a piece of stone that superficially resembles a tool but was never actually shaped by a person, the accidental product of natural fracturing that happens to mimic the appearance of deliberate craftsmanship. In 2021, two archaeologists, Jim Chatters and Ben Potter, published a detailed rebuttal arguing that the Chikwih White stones lacked the consistent, repeated flaking patterns that typically distinguish genuine human toolmaking from coincidental natural damage. Ardelean and his colleagues pushed back forcefully, maintaining that anyone who had directly examined the artifacts, rather than judged them from photographs and published descriptions, could recognize clear signs of deliberate human work. Neither side has definitively won this argument. Chikwih White remains an open and genuinely contested question in the field, a case where two groups of serious researchers looked at the same physical evidence and reached fundamentally different conclusions, with no human bone or campfire to settle the dispute either way. It's precisely because sites like Chikwih White and the Cheruti Mastodon remain so hotly debated that one particular discovery, made not long ago in the gypsum flats of White Sands, New Mexico, stands out so sharply. There, researchers found something that cannot be explained away as a natural accident or a trick of geology. Footprints. Human footprints, pressed into what was once the muddy shoreline of an ancient lake, left by adults and children alike. In one especially striking sequence, the footprints of a person appear to follow directly alongside the tracks of a giant ground sloth, suggesting someone was tracking the animal across the mud. A footprint isn't a stone that might have been shaped by chance. It is, by definition, the direct physical impression of a human body in motion. There's no plausible way for natural forces to accidentally produce the sole of a child's foot pressed into ancient clay. Researchers dated the site using multiple independent methods across separate laboratories. Radiocarbon dating of seeds found in the same sedimentary layers, along with analysis of pollen and quartz grains. The results converged on a consistent range of roughly 21 to 23,000 years old, placing confirmed human presence in North America thousands of years before the Clovis migration was ever supposed to have happened. Unlike the more contested sites, the White Sands footprints left little room for alternative explanation. This wasn't a stone that might have been shaped by falling rock, or a bone that might have cracked under sediment pressure. It was the unambiguous physical record of people walking across a lakeshore, thousands of years earlier than the traditional timeline allowed. Taken all together, the picture that emerges is genuinely remarkable. A butchered horse bone in a frozen Yukon cave, confirmed at roughly 24,000 years old. A contested stone assemblage high in a Mexican mountain cave, potentially over 30,000 years old. Unmistakable human footprints in New Mexico, dated to at least 21,000 years. And at the outermost, most disputed edge of it all, a broken mastodon skeleton in San Diego whispering a date of 130,000 years, a claim that most archaeologists still aren't ready to accept, for reasons that are themselves entirely reasonable, since a single fossil cannot rewrite an entire field on its own. What's clear is that the old, comfortable story of a single wave of hunters crossing an Ice Age land bridge 13,000 years ago and simply walking south to populate 2 continents no longer fits the evidence coming out of the ground. The Clovis people, once cast as the original pioneers of the Americas in every museum display and textbook illustration, increasingly look like relative latecomers to a story that had already been unfolding for tens of thousands of years before they arrived. What remains genuinely uncertain is who came before them. Were these early arrivals members of our own species, Homo sapiens, reaching the Americas far sooner than anyone previously believed possible? Were they an entirely different branch of the human family tree, Neanderthals, Denisovans, or some population science hasn't yet identified, who made it to this continent and then disappeared without leaving behind a name? Or will some of these contested finds eventually be explained by natural processes after all, leaving the traditional timeline more intact than these dramatic headlines suggest? Right now, nobody can say for certain. What can be said is that the ground still has more to tell us. Every one of these sites started the same way. A broken bone, a strange stone, a footprint in the mud, dismissed at first, and only much later taken seriously. Somewhere out there, the next piece of the story is very likely still buried, waiting for the right person to notice that what looks like an ordinary rock or an ordinary bone might not be ordinary at all.